Welcome to Making Democracy Work, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Honolulu and Olelo. We bring up topics of community interest, and nothing could be more interesting now than the primary election that is just passed. We're taping this on the Tuesday after the primary election, and I have with me Neil Milner, who is a retired professor from University of Hawaii and a very popular political commentator. Chad Blair from Civil Beat, who is the political,
Reporter
of Civil Beat. So welcome to both of you. What an interesting election we had.
I still haven't recovered, Pearl. It's only been a couple of days, and as you know, it's not over.
That's right,
because
yes.
the U.S. Senate race is being closely contested in Puna if the election still goes on as scheduled this Friday.
Right, yes. So this is going to air after the Friday that it is scheduled. So we still don't know what the outcome is, but isn't it interesting that they are doing it so fast? Because there have been lots of protests that, you know, they're not ready. They don't even have water. They don't have electricity.
Well, I don't know how many protests there have been. There's certainly been protests from the Hanabusa side because she's in deep trouble. And if whenever the election is held there, whether it's within 21 days, but certainly within the short time period, she is very, very unlikely to get enough votes. So you do what you can to create a process that may work better for you. But to me, it's the only election I ever heard where volunteers carry chainsaws and bottled water, and that's what it seems to be, right? You've got these volunteers going in, you know, going to the houses and cutting their way in as a favor to.
I didn't see the chainsaws,
Well,
but that's a good idea.
I talked,
Neil's right on. We've actually got a crew down in Puna right now, and I can tell you I did speak with the Congresswoman today, and there are some others that are joining our call. Pat Psyche, the chairwoman of the Republican Party, and it's all happening very quickly, is saying we're not ready yet. There's people that don't even know there's an election because cell phones are out. Wireless is already spotty, period, down there. It's a very large rural area. And then Russell Ruderman, the state senator from Puna, and Barbara Ford, I hope I have her name correctly, she's the county council member near that area, saying it's not just Puna that was having problems. It's too soon. Can we wait a little bit until we have more time, till more people have their services restored? But having said that, as of Tuesday, I did speak to the elections office today, and they said, we think we can do it. We've talked to the folks down there. We've talked to Civil Defense, and the Attorney General, and the County Clerk, and they're under the assumption that most roads have been cleared and folks will be able to get to this polling precinct.
Yeah. Well, one more, I mean, that isn't, I'm not sure if that is the most fascinating part of this election, right?
That's true.
What would you be referring to, Charles, specifically?
You know, it's interesting when you do political analyst stuff, TV night, you're up there forever. And for the most part, there's really nothing going on. I mean, unless you want it, because between the printouts, all there is showing the candidates' headquarters, which is not all that interesting if you're sitting up there. So, and most of the time, Hawaii elections don't have enough to keep you going, right? This time, there was always this energy generated by the bad weather and how that would affect it, but by two very different exciting things. One was this huge disparity that showed up between Abercrombie and Eagate right away.
Yes.
If you saw that normally, you would say somebody's cooking the books. It was so big. And the other one is that from the get-go, the Schatz Hanabusa election was close. So you had two things that often are just totally missing from, from politics.
At one point, Senator Schatz and Colleen Hanabusa were apart by just a mere 11
votes.
11 votes, and Schatz was saying later, all he could do was laugh when that happened because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. But with David Ige and Neil Abercrombie, it was just stunning how even the early returns, which reflected the absentee and some of the early walk-in, had him up by a 2-to-1 margin, a margin that did not change for the rest of the night. A stunning defeat for Abercrombie, who in many ways is a household name here. He's been in politics for 40 years.
Yes.
And it's so stunning and so large, much larger than the polls were a little bit wacky and inconsistent generally, but it looked like one of the things that they agreed on was that the Ige had grabbed the lead very early, that people kept saying the size of that margin, which was always about, what, 10 points, 12 points, was going to disappear over time and that maybe Ige would pull it out. The last polling still had him with that lead, but that lead was a third of what it turns, right? Well, yeah, almost a third of what it turned out to be. And I suspect that there's something that went on here that was very extraordinary in terms of how voters think about it. I don't think you can explain this just by saying Neil Abercrombie made a lot of mistakes and had a bad record, because it's an awfully low bar that you have to deal with if you're the incumbent. I mean, if 4 out of 5 incumbent governors who ran for re-election over the last 30 years have won, which in fact is the case, you got to assume that a whole lot of those had low approval ratings, and I'm guessing even lower than Abercrombie's, which was low, but not catastrophically low, you would think, and also had as much controversy on their record. So something else.
Would you like to speculate?
Yeah, I can speculate because I've been thinking about it, but it is pretty speculative. I think that the voters went through a process here that's very different from what a normal voter does, especially when an incumbent runs. A normal voter, if they pay any attention at all, will pretty much go along with an incumbent. And even if they have some disapproval, that disapproval doesn't move them from an attitude of disapproval to an actual behavior change. That's a big jump, especially if you're a good Democrat and you're voting for someone else. So there was, I think, and I can't say this any more clearly because it's just hard to grab onto, I think there was a level of political conversation that went on in the community, not real formal kind of stuff, but I noticed it myself. People were saying, did you hear what Neil did here? Did you hear what Neil did there? And somehow this transformed into this kind of story about how incompetent the governor was that moved a lot more people into not just disapproving of Abercrombie, but voting against him than you would normally find. And that's the best I can do, because, and to me, that's more extraordinary than the Ige campaign, which I didn't find all that, I didn't find the Ige campaign all that. It obviously worked, so who cares, at one level. But it's not like they did anything innovative. It's not like the candidate himself generated a lot of buzz. Something else was more extraordinary than Neil's mistakes and the campaign.
I'll throw out a couple of thoughts here.
Yeah.
Abercrombie never went above 50% in terms of his approval ratings. And many people in our polls, and Neil's right, they were all over the place, although it's looking like all 4 of our polls, if Schatz prevails, will turn out to have been at least correct in calling the winner. But what we saw early on is they were voting for David Ige simply because they didn't like Neil Abercrombie. Somewhere along the way, they started to actually say they are voting for Ige because they like what he's saying. He had a 59% approval rating in our last poll, which is about a week before the election. And this, I think, dovetailed with what Ige was noticing. He said somewhere around 8 to 10 weeks ago, the crowd started getting larger. And he really, sure, he's not much of a public speaker. He had no money, outraised 10 to 1, $5 million to $500,000. And yet, there was something about this personality, the anti-Abercrombie. He is the exact opposite of Neil Abercrombie in so many ways. I mean, think about this. The economy is healthy. Construction is booming. Tourism's doing fine. Unemployment is 4.4%. And Abercrombie did have some solid victories. Yes. And frankly, no major scandals and a heck of a lot of really good people in his cabinet. What made people decide to do this? We're going to be scratching our head for a long time, but...
I think there's some interesting kind of political psychology stuff that went on here that we know about how people make decisions. The first one is not so much along those lines, but I think it was there. I think Abercrombie had lost this election before another candidate came along. I think people liked Ige before they knew him, which is very different. I mean, you take someone like Tulsi Gabbard when she ran against
Right.
Mufi
Hanneman.
or all of these candidates in the 1st Congressional District. Their first task was to get known. He didn't really have to go through that stuff. And there is a phenomenon that exists about how people make decisions where they often make a choice and then over time develop the arguments in defense of their choice. You don't rationally go through policies or whatever to pick someone or to make a decision in favor of something. Lots of times, it's very common, you make a decision in favor of someone, in a sense using your gut, using something that's important to you, but not necessarily rational argument, and then you do it. And that might be what happened with Ige. People were attached to him in a kind of emotional way before they really had much substance there, and then over time, they began to look for and find reasons to support him.
He was also able to do something. I mean, think about this. Even though some people may have suspected that the governor was vulnerable, nobody came forward. There was talk that Hanabusa would run for governor. In fact, she was torn, Senate or governor. But of course, Dan Inouye wanted her to run for Senate. Gabbard herself, there was rumors that this young 31-year-old congresswoman, 33, was going to come back and run against Abercrombie. But nobody stepped forward. And when David Ige stepped forward, most people's reaction was, who? And are you kidding me? But I think he was able to take away from the governor's strongest playing card, which is that he had run a solidly fiscal situation with the state, that he deserved credit from going from a deficit to a positive balance. In fact, David Ige, as chair of Ways and Means, had a heck of a lot to do with that, and I think he was able to chip away gradually at that calling card of the governor's, if you will, to say, wait a minute, there's other competent people around here too. In fact, I'm more competent than you, perhaps.
You know, it's interesting. If what I think you're likely to see now is, now that the Democrats have achieved some kind of unity, is the story's going to change. It's going to be how David Ige and Neil Abercrombie worked hand in hand as good government to produce. And you know what? That argument has as much validity as, because a lot of this, you exaggerate controversy and difference in order to beat your opponent. And so, and when I look at no legislature gets along all that well with governor. It doesn't make any difference if you're a Democrat or a Republican. There are institutional differences, and there should be.
There were other races.
No.
No.
Governor, Senate.
Yeah.
It seems like GMO was quite important in some of the local races, right?
We've reported on this, and it was particularly pronounced, as you might expect, on Maui and Kauai, and a little bit on the Big Island. There were candidates that were running, if not exclusively, pretty darn singularly on a anti-GMO position. By no coincidence, Maui, or rather the Big Island and Kauai, is where the legislation has been passed to regulate and control and so forth. And Maui actually has a ballot initiative this fall to actually put a moratorium in place until the companies like Monsanto actually pay for a study to find out whether they're dangerous or not. But I don't know how well it played out. We did a story that's up this week on the GMO candidate slate on Kauai, where it's probably the most pronounced. And in fact, it looked like a lot of the pro-GMO candidates advanced. They include Jimmy Tokioka, the longtime state representative. He ran against Gary Hoozer's son, Dylan. Tokioka won handily. The mayor, Bernard Carvalho Jr., did very well, although he has a runoff against a surfer, Dustin Barca, who I believe is also anti-GMO. But it hasn't yet materialized in forcing somebody out of office.
Now let's make this clear. When you say pro-GMO, that would mean that they are against the anti-GMO initiatives that are afoot.
I would characterize it this way. They don't believe that the science indicates that genetically modified organisms are dangerous. They do agree that there might need to be control and regulation of pesticides. Some are even open to the idea of labeling, but they just don't buy the argument from the anti-GMO folks that it's unsafe.
And you have to be careful not to buy the argument that some of the anti-GMO people make in this, that it's these large corporations, Monsanto and all those, that are throwing money in. This is a big national issue for lots of wealthy environmentalists who see this just as Monsanto sees it on the other side, as a kind of wedge place, as a place that it's important to establish their own policies. And I think you're going to see more than that. considering the fact that the state punted on GMO, I mean, the state said, it said, let the counties decide, which is one of the most interesting examples. The states give home rule away when they don't want to touch an issue. There's no principled reason here to give this home rule as opposed to most other things. But I think that's what, and I really think, I mean, same-sex marriage gets a lot of attention for it being so contentious. I think that issue is going to start to diminish. I think GMO is probably the most contentious issue in terms of what brings out political emotions still at an active level.
I agree that it's not going to go away, and we've actually studied where those contributions were coming from, and sure enough, a lot of it is coming not only from the biotech companies, the seed crop companies, but also these PACs being formed representing the anti-GMO folks. So it is not going to go away. It is indeed a national issue. I will say that the Abercrombie folks and the Agricultural Department under Scotty Enright, I wouldn't say they've completely punted and given it over to the counties. I think they feel strongly that the counties have gone too far. Remember, there's some lawsuits at play here too, but I do agree with Neil, we have not seen the end of it. Same-sex marriage, I think we're going to have to wait until the general to see whether it's decisive. I didn't look at every single candidate, but similar to GMO, there were a number of candidates running on a, if you will, anti-same-sex marriage platform. Now, they're not probably going to be able to overturn the decision. Look at the way the country's going. Even in states that ban same-sex marriage, the courts are overturning this because of what happened to the Supreme Court. But a lot of those candidates are Republicans, and you won't see how they really fare until the general election, and they include Duke Aiona and Mufi Hanneman.
Well, this is a story that I heard secondhand, and I want to make it clear, but it comes from a very well-known political reporter who was at a public meeting with a bunch of ministers in Duke Aiona, and other people were there, and one of the people in the audience raised her hand and said, "What can we do to stop same-sex marriage?" And this reporter said to me that Aiona gave this very sensitive, well-thought-out answer that, you know, we may be at a point where public policy isn't going to allow us to do it. We may, as good Christians, have to make our own choices. And there's two things that are really impressive about that. One, it's a pretty nuanced argument, but two, it's a clear indication that even though same-sex marriage can work for some Republicans, working doesn't mean that you can, in this state, or probably not most places anymore, use that as the sole issue to carry you through. I think that people who try to do that with same-sex marriage will have some of the same results that the anti-GMO.
And it didn't,
you can't win.
I think that's true. Again, I would hold out until the general, but there was an example, prominent example in the primary, Cynthia Phelan, as moderate a Republican as you can possibly be, pro-hemp research, renewable energy, and who also has long advocated first for civil unions and same-sex marriage. I think the only Republican this time around who voted for it. She handily defeated a Kailua pastor named Joan Hood, and she was one of the sort of the bellwether cases to see how this is going to go forward. So we'll see how this one plays out, but I sense it doesn't quite have the legs. Duke Aiona is a lawyer, a judge. He can, I think, kind of see which way things are blowing, and he also wants to win very badly.
Well, and you also can watch that it isn't like, you know, we have a weak Republican Party here, so there's always this real difficulty to find your place in order to maintain a kind of Republican base but get other voters. But it's also true within the evangelical movement on the mainland that they're having to come to grips with this. You know, people have to figure out a way to maintain their own kind of moral sense and think about how much they can get out of politics. And evangelicals have gone through this for a number of other issues, but they're clearly the same kind of thing here. There's a lot more caution about anti-same-sex discussion than there used to be because politicians are careful and supporters of politicians are beginning to understand it. I don't want to make it sound like it's gone away. That's not what I mean at all, and I think Chad is right.
I'll throw out one other point as well. Speaking of another race that we haven't talked about, but the 1st Congressional District, you had 7 Democrats, 6 of them fairly well-known, established, 1 or 2 extremely well-known, and yet the one candidate who was against same-sex marriage, Donna Mercado Kim, for her faith reasons, lost that election to Mark Takai. Mark Takai previously had been opposed to same-sex marriage, civil unions, but came around, even received the endorsement of Equality Hawaii, I believe, one of the prominent groups supporting marriage equality. He saw the handwriting on the wall. Donna Kim herself even admitted, I think she said she had was it a gay sister or the godmother to her son. She was for civil unions, but
She didn't exactly walk around with a sign saying, "I voted."
No, she didn't.
This
But
was
she
not.
did answer the question
Yes,
honestly
that's right,
and,
yeah.
and said it was because of her faith. And I'm sure there were other reasons that she lost the race to Mark Takai.
But wouldn't it have been interesting if we had an all-female congressional district?
Yes.
Well, I tell you this, you may end up with an all-Japanese American. Well, I guess it wouldn't be, but
No, that's right.
that's another thing that happened. Not a congressional delegation, but you're right. Had Donna won, and if Colleen were able to defeat Brian, you would have four women.
So wait, we have a Buddhist, we have a Hindu.
Two
we have
Buddhists.
Two Buddhists. It sounds like a
And a
bar
Jew.
joke. And a Jew sounds like a two Buddhists that you walk into a bar. So we have, it's like the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court has no Protestants. What used to be a Protestant bastion has half Catholics and half Jews.
Exactly.
We don't have any Christians in our delegation.
But I did want to point out, it is interesting, you have a Japanese-American ticket running for governor and lieutenant governor, Shan Satsui and David Ige, and Mark Takai winning the congressional seat. Of course, he's up against Charles Deju, who's Chinese and Thai. And then we'll see what happens with Hanabusa and Schatz. I will say this, we're a diverse lot. And it's it's wonderful to be from such a diverse state.
I want to get back to what you said about what the state legislature did on GMOs. Now, you said that they essentially punted, but gave the counties, or did they just not do anything?
Not do anything. Not
Right.
do
Okay.
anything.
They didn't actually
Right.
give counties anything.
There's
right?
there's a variety of things they could have done, and at least one, it was pretty clear they decided, what the bill, that kind of agricultural rights bill, which is not exactly like those agricultural rights bills.
It's a farmer's
It's a farmer's rights thing, the
yeah.
right to
Yeah.
farm thing, but it basically would enable GMOs. So they didn't. That bill never got very far. The head of the Ag Committee wanted that one in there. They didn't make big statements about home rule. They didn't. This is not one of those things about tax money and law enforcement or wherever. They just kind of let it slide. The legislature,
Yeah.
and it's understandable. There really wasn't anything that they could do without getting into significant trouble. And sometimes that's as good a principle, not always, sometimes that's as good a principle as any way to back away.
The basic concern was that they would, being a state, they would somehow interfere with the Commerce Clause of the
Yes,
federal
that's-
government.
yeah.
And the idea is, let's wait and see what the federal government does. Vermont, for example, right now is looking at possibly labeling, and there are some proposals in the Congress, but right now they felt that whatever they did, let's see how things turn out with those lawsuits as well in the counties. But there was pressure to pass a labeling bill. I think they did pass.
Yeah.
I don't even know if the study even got passed, whether the resolution to study the issue.
Man, if you don't get a study passed.
Yeah, if you
it's-
can't get a study
No,
passed at the legislature, you can't get anything done. But setting up a task force, that's the typical way that the legislature says, let's just kick that can down the road.
Okay, now, were there other issues? We have about 4 minutes left. So what else about this wonderful, fascinating election do we want to talk about?
Well, I was joking with some folks the other day that the threat of 2 hurricanes was God's punishment for low voter turnout. And it turns out the turnout was even lower.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it hit the historic low, but it was 41.4%. I did notice that it was significantly lower, at least 38% or so on the Big Island. And Maui, I believe, had the lowest. And of course, they took the brunt of the storm.
Yes.
And I have to think that a lot of folks maybe just didn't go. Certainly there were people that couldn't go. But you had all this hope that finally we were going to,
Not going to happen.
that the registration numbers were up, the absentee ballot seemed to be up, and it didn't happen.
Yep. It didn't happen, and I don't think there's any reason to think that it will happen in the future. I don't even know, I want to be careful here because I'm not sure. I think that those turnout numbers may be inflated. The best measure of turnout is not the percentage of registered voters, it's the percentage of eligible voters. And the serious turnout operations in this country, the one that ranked Hawaii last in the presidential election, does it that way.
That's based on eligible
Voters
versus
rather
the
than
state
registered
statistics
voters.
is registered.
Registered voters.
And that's a good
That's
point.
right.
And in
So-
both cases, we're essentially last.
Yes, that's right. We
Yeah.
are last. So it's like being the bottom of the worst football team in the country according to the coaches poll, according to the AP poll.
Having said that, what a contrast with the fact that about a 2-to-1 margin, a sitting governor is rejected. There was a Larry Sabato's crystal ball had a report this week saying no sitting governor in a primary has ever lost by such a large margin.
And remember, this was, if the turnout wasn't increased, which it wasn't, it isn't that you got, at least not likely, a whole bunch of new voters that got mobilized to vote into this. That's something, this is probably the same old pattern. And that's what it gets back to what I said earlier. It was people who normally would, 8 out of 10 times, would vote for the incumbent.
Yeah.
Turn this around here. And these were people, and the one final point on that, if you looked at the final polls with Abercrombie, a good portion of his supporters had decided to support him over 3 months ago.
Yeah.
Right? And then after that, I think that misses
About
some-
2/3 made up their mind in the
Yeah.
last 2 months. Ige.
But I think, again, that there was this sense of anybody but Abercrombie
Yeah.
that was really pretty well established.
Colleen Hanabusa has to be kicking herself right now.
Yeah.
Maybe I should have gone for governor.
All right, now, you each have 30 seconds to make a prediction about the general election.
I see Democrats uniting around David Ige. I do think you should not underestimate Duke Iona. I don't see Hanneman being a factor. He got 2,000 votes in the primary. I wouldn't underestimate the man. But Iona has done well in the polling, and my guess is Iona and Hanneman draw from the same people. And I'm thinking most of them are going to bank on Iona, thinking that if they can get this in, he's the guy to go with, get a Republican back in office.
I agree with Chad that I don't think Mufi Hanneman is going to be a factor because he has no constituency. My feeling about both Duke Iona and Charles Zhu is the problem with those two guys is that they've run excellent campaigns before and lost. In fact, I asked you about this election night. I said, what can you do different? He's got an answer, but it's not a very convincing one. If you've done really well, and they're both good candidates, they really are. I think the Zhu is especially. He's personable. He's
smart.
He's principled conservative without being rabid about it. He knows how to talk to people well. He's a sweet guy. And he lost. And I don't know what you can do. Political analysis here isn't all that hard. You always say the Democrats are going to win, and you're going to be right most of the time. That's my secret. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, too, for a very, very
Thank you,
interesting
Pearl.
discussion.
Thanks, Pearl.
Neil Milner, political analyst, retired UH professor. Chad Blair, political editor from Civil Beat.
You just promoted me, thank you.
I'll write
Thank
the
you.
reference.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank
Thanks.
you for watching Making Democracy Work from the League of Women Voters. Thank you for watching.